My name's Dana Toole. I work for the Montana Department of Justice in the Division of Criminal Investigation, and I run a conglomeration of programs called the Children's Justice Center programs. I'm an LCSW. I've worked with kids and families in Montana for more than 25 years now in all different kinds of capacities, in child care, foster care, child protective services for 8 years. I've done lots of work with child sexual abuse and other kinds of serious child abuse, and been on foster care review committees, done foster adoptive home studies. I've done family law mediation, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I've basically been immersed in working with kids and families in Montana for my whole career. And at the Department of Justice, I've been there since 2008. The 2007 legislature funded DOJ for a program that's purpose was to promote a multidisciplinary team approach to child victims of sexual abuse in Montana communities, to equip and train Montana communities to do a best practice response to victims of child sexual abuse. So that was how I got started at DOJ. I had been one of the founding members of our local multidisciplinary team and the founding director of our Children's Advocacy Center in Helena. And so it made sense to move over to DOJ when that funding came in and help other communities in Montana develop teams and centers. You have a multidisciplinary team here in Missoula County, and you have a Children's Advocacy Center at First Step Resource Center. They're one of our 5 nationally accredited children's advocacy centers in the state, so you should all be very proud of that. And the kids and families in Missoula County are lucky to have that resource. There's also an accredited CAC in Ravalli County called Emma's House that you may ultimately have kids that have been served by either or both of those programs. I also, when they looked around DOJ in all the corners and found everything that had anything to do with responding to child victims of crime, they decided to put the sex or violent offender registry in the Children's Justice Center. It isn't that all of the citizens in Montana who have been sexually assaulted are children, but a good number of them are, and so I manage the sex or violent offender registry and have been doing that for about a year. And then last July we hired a drug endangered children coordinator who is just a little less than a year into starting a statewide drug endangered children program, and her job is to help Montana communities learn to recognize drug endangered children and develop training and resources so that the professionals who respond to a child will have adequate tools to address the impact of caregiver drug use in that child's life. And so there's a lot going on. I'm also expecting well, the legislature is still in Helena, and there's been some interesting legislation the last few months. I think we've got about 2 weeks left with them. But there is a bill that's still alive and well that creates an ombudsman for child and family services cases and puts that ombudsman position in the Department of Justice. And so if that bill actually survives the session, I expect that we will have that position over at Department of Justice too. So it's not necessarily a typical thing for a state Department of Justice to have identified or segregated clearly all of the resources that we have for responding to child victims of crime. There are some states that do that, but it is a pretty progressive effort, and I think everybody should be proud that in Montana our Department of Justice is very focused in dedicating resources to child victims of crime and abuse as well. So I also, before I start with our client-centered advocacy, skills for working with people who live in poverty, tonight I want to give credit where credit is due. The reason this training exists is that Montana Legal Services Association, I worked there for about 4 years, from 2004 to 2008, after I finished grad school. And I was helping them coordinate a family law mediation program, working with parents who were having trouble developing parenting plans in the best interest of their children. And when I started to work at Montana Legal Services, I was their only social worker on staff, and I said, well, because their mission is to serve low-income and poverty-level families in their civil legal needs, it seemed to me that it made sense to put together a training that had specific information about the impacts of living in poverty. And much to my delight, when I said that to the director, she said, yeah, that's great, do that. So I was like, oh, this is great. I have a job where I can like research and put this all together. And we did that, and we started taking it out, I think, in 2006 or 7. And we vetted it with our in-state legal services offices, and it went to a couple of national trainings. And without legal services having said, yes, this is important information and you should take the time to put it together, and the staff helping do that, we wouldn't have this training. So what I did was I researched a lot of different sources about poverty in the United States. And it's important for you all to know that this is about poverty in the United States, because everything is relative. And although we have got some horrific poverty in the United States, what I talk about here wouldn't necessarily apply in another country or another culture in terms of poverty. But I don't know what that's doing. Oh, I don't need any support. I always like to thank legal services for that. All right, remind me in 2 hours. Why don't we try that? There we go. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is working with families who live in poverty or have low income. I do really appreciate all of you taking the time to do this class on top of everything else you do, and to make a commitment to kids who need adults who will watch out for them, because it really will make a difference. So let's talk about poverty. So why do we need to understand poverty? Why is it important? There's a ton of research on poverty. I immediately found out as I set out to study this. And I haven't invented any of this information or come to any grand conclusions or studied anything myself particularly, although I have some anecdotal stories. But what I did was I looked at a lot of different kinds of research and just put it together in a way that it's accessible for you. I think it's important to understand poverty because outside the reason that most of the children that you will have on your caseloads have lived in poverty or are still living in poverty, the fact of the matter is that in the United States, poverty and issues related to poverty drive a tremendous amount of public policy development and law. And I would suggest that people who live in poverty in communities in the United States are the most regulated set of citizens that we have in the entire country. These are folks who, in order to get their basic needs met, have to open their homes for inspection. They have to provide paycheck stubs on demand. They may have to provide medical records on demand. The amount of engagement between the government and individuals in poverty is tremendous. And it isn't something I think that in general our communities think about, but I really believe that people who live in poverty are our most regulated segment in the United States. So that's important. The other reason is that if you understand more about anyone or what drives their decision making or lifestyle choices, then you're going to have a better relationship and fewer misunderstandings. And I think that's critically important in your work too, because you may not understand why a mom or a dad of one of the kiddos on your caseload makes a particular choice if you don't understand what their day-to-day life is really like. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So it's important to understand it. The first thing I learned was there's a lot of poverty terminology, and that everyone who researched poverty set out to coin a new term that meant something the same as the other guy, but they couldn't all use the same words in their dissertation. So these were just some of my favorites. Intergenerational economic inequality. I can't remember what that one means actually. Intergenerational poverty transmission really means poverty that moves in the same family from one generation to the next. Persistent versus transitory poverty is another way of saying generational poverty or situational poverty, because there are different kinds of poverty. And then one of my very favorite was intragenerational economic mobility. So I just, I had people thought those up, put them in books, and I wanted to share them with you. The type of poverty that we're going to talk about tonight in general is actually generational poverty. The difference between situational and generational poverty is that any one of us could be thrown into situational poverty through the loss of a wage earner, some illness or accident that generated thousands and tens of thousands of dollars of medical expenses, perhaps an act of God or nature like a tornado, a hurricane, a flood. Katrina threw tens of thousands of people who were not living in poverty into poverty. They lost their homes, they lost all their assets. People who never believed that they would be in poverty are probably just beginning to recover from that. And divorce is another type of action in people's lives that may create situational poverty. In general, the definition is that situational poverty lasts for about 5 years, 5 to 7 years. And that by the end of 5 years from the event that caused the poverty to start with, the drop in income, people who were not in poverty before that event will have recovered probably to their former level of income. The reason for that is that people who are not in poverty until some event happens generally have got more savings to start with, so they have more to fall back on. They generally had more assets, so they may lose a house but still actually have a reliable car. They probably have stronger support systems in terms of other people in their lives who have got the economic resources to give them, to help them through a rough time, and who are willing and able to do that without it also dragging another family into poverty. And they may have more education or training in a trade than someone who's always lived in poverty. So situational poverty is really very different, and that's not much what we're talking about tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about generational poverty, which is a family who's lived in poverty for 2 generations or more. So this would be grandparents who lived in poverty, raising their children in poverty, those children having that next generation, and also there not ever being a period of time where any of those generations' income or assets rose above the poverty guidelines. And so that's what we're, don't need any updates. Postpone. I don't use this computer very often. So that's what we're talking about tonight. But I did get a kick out of the lingo. I just changed this screen this afternoon because I was like, oh, it's 2013. Last time I did this, it was 2012. Every year, the U.S. Public Health Department puts out the annual guidelines for poverty. And if you want to look at those, you'd go to usa.gov and just put in poverty guidelines and it'll pop up. And I did print out some information that I'll hand out in a little bit about how they developed these. So for 2013, it didn't change much. For a household of 4, the poverty guideline is $23,550. Until I changed it this afternoon, it was $23,050. So the income actually went up $500. And then there's a table, if you look on the website, and you add a certain amount of money per person, per additional person in the household. One of the things that I learned when I set out to do this research was that poverty and low income are not the same. You often will hear people using poverty and low income as interchangeable terms, but they're not. Low income guidelines are usually 150% of whatever the poverty guideline is. However, depending on your source of information, and because there are so many different government programs that serve people who live in poverty, you may see a range of the low income line being up to 200% of poverty. It just depends on where you look. And I think it's important to talk about this because does anyone here know how the United States, how or when the United States government decided to establish poverty guidelines? Okay. It was during the 1960s, and it was in the era when Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, after Kennedy, had visions of what is referred to historically as the Great Society, which had a facet called the War on Poverty. And so I think in order for the federal government to decide to actually do a war on poverty, they had to define poverty. And so it was in the early 1960s. I have heard and seen from some pretty reliable sources that the federal government is currently scrutinizing the mechanism by which they come up with this number every year, and they're trying to revamp the whole process, which I think is a pretty good thing. Because one of the things that I was most surprised by when I did this research was that this is actually a fairly arbitrary number. It's not really tied to anything that's very realistic. So think about a family of 4 now having to, if it's 2 parents and 2 kids, having to actually keep shoes on kids' feet, pay rent. Question?
Well, I'm saying that would vary dramatically from where in the country you're at. I mean, if you're in North Bay, you're like,
yeah,
that's not going to be good enough for one person.
Well, and it's interesting enough that you brought that up, because right under the table that shows the 48 states poverty guidelines is a table just for Alaska, because in Alaska it's 29,000 some odd, and then I think there's one for Hawaii and also Puerto Rico and those places. So I usually just tell this story because I forget to bring it with me, and then I'm never sure I got it right, so I remembered to print it out today. So here's how the poverty threshold was originally developed. It was developed in 1963, 1964 by Molly Orshansky of the Social Security Administration. And she published an analysis of the poverty population using these thresholds in a January 1965 Social Security Bulletin article. She based her poverty thresholds on the Economy Food Plan, which was the cheapest of 4 food plans developed by the Department of Agriculture. In post-World War II America, there was a tremendous amount of focus on how homes ran, how families spent their money, and also on food production and how we moved food from a field or standing on hoofs into a family's kitchen. And so the Department of Agriculture had tons of information about that. So Molly looked at the cheapest of the 4 food plans. These food plans were combinations of foods devised by the Agriculture Department dietitians using complex procedures, and they constituted nutritionally adequate diets. And the plan that she chose was called the Economy Food Plan, and it was described as being for temporary or emergency use by a family when funds were low. So she knew from the Department of Agriculture that families of 3 or more spent about 1/3 of their after-tax income on food in 1955. Accordingly, she calculated poverty thresholds for families of 3 or more persons by taking the dollar cost of the Economy Food Plan for families of those sizes and multiplying those costs by a factor of 3. In effect, she took a hypothetical average family spending 1/3 of its income on food and assumed that it had to cut back on expenditures sharply. When the food expenditures of the hypothetical family reached the cost of the Economy Food Plan, which remember was supposed to be only for emergencies, she assumed the amount the family would then be spending on non-food items would also be minimal but adequate. Interestingly enough, her formula did not assign any actual dollar values to any of the categories in the imaginary budget for her hypothetical family. She derived poverty thresholds for two-person families by multiplying the dollar cost of the food plan for that family size, but used a higher multiplier. So what she did was she took the budget of a family with no actual dollar amounts, assumed that 33% of that budget went to food, and that family suddenly had to cut way, way back. And she developed a formula to cut the budget back, but she cut the budget the same for every category, not just for food. So if you pay rent or have a mortgage and you suddenly lose income, can you really go to the bank and say, hey, I can't pay but half my house payment this month, or call your landlord and say, you know, I'm not going to be able to pay all my rent for a while? Usually in a real family, when tough choices have to be made, the housing is a fixed cost, and all the other costs have to fluctuate to accommodate keeping housing. Molly's budget didn't do that. It cut everything across the board exactly the same. And so I brought copies of these for you guys because it's long and involved, but any of you are interested in figuring out exactly how she did it. What I think is really interesting about this, and I always kind of feel for poor Molly because she's part of the United States history now, and I suspect it just got assigned to her fairly randomly, like happens in government jobs. Someone came into her office one day and said, hey, we need a poverty threshold. Here, figure it out. And so she did the best she could. It is, however, really arbitrary. And yet, it defines in a very, very real way how families who live in poverty get their basic needs met or don't get their basic needs met on a daily basis. And so I'm glad that the federal government is re-examining that, because the other thing is that it really just hasn't changed much. I mean, I've been giving this presentation since 2006 now, for 6 years, and I have not watched this number every year when I update it change hardly at all. But we all know that economics have changed a lot.
They tie it to CPI, I'm pretty sure, and we're actually deflating right now. It's probably what's not.
Yeah, the consumer price index, right. So that was one of the first things I learned is this is important. And until I learned that, I was working with clients and thinking, yeah, that is what it is, and we'll get the documentation and we'll get what they need. But it's really very arbitrary. Poverty in Montana, we have about 112,000 families with just over 200,000 children. 17% of those children live in families in poverty, and 42% live in low-income families. This I took from the National Center for Children in Poverty, but we've got a really good source of information in Montana called Kids Count, and they have a website. And this year on their Kids Count website, I think the poverty percentage for children in Montana is actually closer to 19 or 20 than 17%. So you have to look around and find a variety of sources.
Saying that 59% of the children live in low-income or poor families, or does the low-income include poor families?
I think, well, it is a high number. And actually, I think it's separated out. We have a lot of poverty in Montana. We really do. And so the highest age group of children in poverty is children under 6. Anybody have any thoughts about why that would be? Single moms. Older kids can go to school. Kids, we have full-day kindergarten in Montana as of a few years ago in all of our public schools, but until then, children couldn't be in school full days, which is really only 8:30 to 3 until they were 6. So someone had to be home with them, or there had to be child care expenses. And it's not a surprise to anybody that 70% of low-income children live with a single parent, whereas only 14% of the children above low income live with a single parenthood is a huge indicator of poverty. So that website, the nccp.org, is also really an interesting, and it's based out of a university, I think out of Columbia, so I think it's a credible source. I always am careful when I look on the internet to make sure it's a credible source. Some other interesting facts about poverty in Montana. 25% of children in poor families have at least one parent employed full-time year-round. And 42% have at least one parent who employed either part of the year or part-time. So what do you think is significant about that? They have jobs. We'll talk later about myths about people who live in poverty, but there is, I think, a tremendous bias out there, depending on where you get your information and what kind of TV and radio you listen to, that people who live in poverty are much more interested in staying in poverty than they are in having jobs. And the fact of the matter is that people who live in poverty can work full-time and still be in poverty. 33% of children in poor families do not have an employed parent, and 15% of children in low-income families do not have an employed parent. And then the last one is also not news to anybody, but not having a high school diploma is also an indicator of a higher likelihood of poverty. Parents who don't have diplomas have a harder time getting enough income to not be in poverty. Something I thought, another interesting fact, 8% of children live in families with no parent present. So how might that happen? Right? Or foster care, incarceration. Whereas children who are not poor, only 2% of those children live in families without a parent present. That's a pretty big difference. So your odds as a child in poverty of either being placed somewhere without a parent present or having circumstances in your family mean that your parents aren't living with you are much higher. Mobility is a tremendous factor in poverty. Families who are in poverty move 2.5 times more on an annual basis than families who are not in poverty. And I was on the school board in Helena for 9 years, and every year the school board would get this mobility report. We'd get all kinds of stats on all our schools, but we had a couple of buildings in the Helena School District that had a higher percentage of children who qualified for free and reduced lunch, which is the way school districts gauge their particular poverty line. And those forms, by the way, are tied to the federal guidelines. And we had one building that had between a 60 and 70% mobility rate. And that building had about 300 elementary kids in it. And what that means is from the first day of school, every child in every classroom is counted. And then on the last day of school, only 30 or 40% of those children are the same kids that were there on the first day of school. All the rest of them have come and go or changed perhaps multiple times per seat in the classroom during the 180-day school year. So let's think about what that means. What's it like to move? What if you had to move a couple times a year? Yeah. And, right? Right, friends. Well, and aren't there a lot of costs associated every time you have to move? You got to figure out how to get your stuff moved. You got to figure out how to reconnect TVs and not telephones so much anymore, but now you need internet. And you may or may not need newer, different stuff for your new house. And then what if the move wasn't your decision? What if you were in unstable, insecure housing and that move wasn't something you wanted to do right then and you didn't actually even get to really choose where you were going? What if not only did you have to move within 30 days because you couldn't stay there anymore, but then you had to find or take whatever was the best you could get with the resources you had in whatever part of town or near town that you could get that would accommodate your family, and there was really no choice involved in that either. And it wasn't anywhere near the school where your kids have been going. It wasn't anywhere near your job. And that happens 2.5 times more often to people who live in poverty than it does to people who don't. Huge impact. So it's chaotic. So if you're working with families who things seem kind of chaotic, check and see how many houses they've had in the last 5 years.
It is astounding and I just interviewed a guy had asked if they went to Boston's going to be a CASA, and he had a CASA. And he said he was in 21 different schools in grades, 21 different schools. And they had, its research has shown that for every move from a school to a different school, they lose 2-3 months worth of, they fall behind 2 or 3 months every time they make a move.
Right. Yeah, it's a big deal. And so when you have kids on your CASA caseloads, ask about their educational setting. And you won't generally get kids on your caseloads until there's already temporary legal custody in place and they're already in another setting. But if they have to be moved while they're on your caseloads, make somebody focus on what can we do not to have to change this school. In Helena, our school district was willing to be pretty creative with busing and transporting in order to try to keep kids for the remainder of a school year in their building. It wasn't possible 100% of the time, but it's an important focus because that's really a lot of stability for kids who are already in care to be able to keep their school. So some of the impacts, Dennis just referred to this one in part. Children who grow up living in poverty have an average of 1.4 years less in school. So what's the first thing that comes to mind about that?
You're going to fall behind and you're not going to be able to further your education later on down the road. Like graduating high school, which will lead to college, and we'll just backtrack more and more.
Right. And sometimes this is losing kids about halfway through their sophomore year in high school because either they can't afford to be in school all day because they need to be contributing, or at that point they are so far behind and they know it every day when they go there that it just feels so futile that any one of us faced with that would probably also not go do that every day just to get a diploma. One of the things that I saw happen when I was a CPS worker, and also when I worked with other kids in other capacities, is because of the increased mobility. A child might arrive at a new school a couple weeks before a semester change, or maybe just a month before the end of a school year. And the school district may say, it's a couple weeks till a new semester. How about you just go home, come back in a couple weeks, and we'll start you at the new semester. Or, geez, there's only 3.5 weeks of school left in the school year, and most of that's going to be all, fluffy programs and stuff anyway. So how about you just start again next fall? And who knows if that family would still even be there by next fall. But they do. Yeah. And I hate to, and having been on a school board and believing that public education really needs to be responsive to every child, it makes me sad to know that happens, but I absolutely know that it does. And I don't think it's just one school district. I'm pretty sure they all. And from a teacher's perspective, bringing a new kid in 3 weeks before the end of the school year, that's hard. That's tough. It is. And they may or may not get much academic in that time anyway. However, it adds up. I think really adds up fast for kids. So almost 30% fewer children living in poverty finish high school, as opposed to 9% of children who do not grow up in poverty not finishing high school. The other thing that was interesting is adults who work full-time may live in poverty. And this data all came way before the crash we had in 2008, but I don't think anybody's got any doubt at this point that you can work full-time, assuming you can get a job, and still be living in poverty. People living in poverty work approximately 250 hours less a year and for about 360 less an hour. So why do you suppose if someone is trying to work full-time, they might end up with fewer hours? Pardon?
They don't cover benefits.
They don't cover benefits. Well, and so this is, if you don't have a college or a high school diploma and you haven't been able to get, specific trade training that will bring a decent wage and help you work in the private sector, then you're pretty dependent on retail, food service, kind of hostess, tourist kinds of jobs. They fluctuate a lot. You may be dependent on seasonal work like road construction, house construction, logging, mining, those kinds of things. We have a lot of that in Montana. And those employers don't offer you full-time hours. So you end up, in order to get full-time hours, having to have 2 or more jobs. And that is crazy making and pretty chaotic for those families too. So even if you want to work more, you won't necessarily be allowed to. Even if you're a good employee, you won't necessarily be offered more hours. So some of the impacts of living in poverty. Are you guys all familiar? Have you all heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? He was a psychologist in the 1940s and developed a theory that is still very fundamentally part of any mental health training, as well as a number of others. In order to tend to anything beyond just taking care of your own basic needs every day, all of those basic needs have to be met. So if you don't have secure housing and you don't know where your food supply is coming from on an ongoing basis, and you're not warm enough, and you're not physically safe in your community, so if you're under some kind of physical threat or perceived threat or danger, then it is psychologically impossible for you to tend to any other tasks. You can't do it. And any one of us who had any of our basic secure needs challenged, no matter how well-trained, well-educated, articulate you are, we would lose our ability to tend to any requirement to do a higher level task. Because if you don't know if you have a roof over your head, it's really hard to think about what you're going to talk about, like in therapy, other than I don't have a roof over my head. We just can't do it. And so some of the impacts of living in generational poverty that have gone on and on and on, there is more ongoing stress. Meeting basic needs takes a tremendous amount of time, and when your basic needs are not secure, that's just an ongoing stress in your life. Maintaining relationships is a critically important thing. If you don't have adequate resources every day, it isn't really somebody handing you money that's going to solve that problem. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But it's going to be another human being. So when you have come home and figured out that your food stamps are gone and you only have 1 box of macaroni and cheese left, and you don't get food stamps for another week, and you've got your 3 kids to feed, then you need another person. You need to be able to go out your door, down the street to a neighbor, or pick up your phone and call somebody and say, hey, I'm running short on food for the rest of the month. Can you help? And that's exactly what happens in a community of people who all live with inadequate resources. Yeah, they help each other. Now, the only way that you can count on being able to make that call or go out the door and get a neighbor that's going to be responsive to you, because this is not going to happen just one time. If you live in poverty generationally, this is an ongoing, going to happen over and over, several times a year probably issue. You have to maintain positive relationships, because those folks have to want to help. And so what that means is there has to be reciprocity. If they help you when you're down to your last box of macaroni and cheese for your 3 kids, then the next month when they don't have gas for their car to get to work and they just got a new job and they know that you just got paid and you could give them $5, which probably would only buy less than 2 gallons now, they give you $10 to get to work. you're going to have to cough it up. You're going to have those relationships, and they, in general, need to be positive. And so you have to invest a ton of time in maintaining those. So think about your friendships and family relationships, and think about how the emphasis on those would change if those were critical to your survival. Because what we're really talking about with generational poverty is people who are in survival mode. And they are very good at it. It's an absolute strength. But it requires relationships. Physical health challenges, healthcare needs may go unmet, or healthcare may be harder to access. In the literature about poverty, depression and anxiety were often described as invisibly combined with poverty, meaning it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. What came first, having lived in poverty for 3 generations and being depressed or anxious, or is depression and anxiety undiagnosed and untreated, preventing a person from actually moving out of survival mode? Reduced literacy is a really interesting one. Have any of you guys had experiences with adults who can't read at all or read well? Anybody want to share one of those without any confidential information attached? No?
Apply for food stamps if you can't fill out the form.
Right?
You can't look up the phone number. You can't use the internet. You can't, not only do you not know how to fill out or use resources, you don't even know how to find or access them. And looking for or asking for help is how you find help if you don't know how to read. It's really sets you apart from the rest of the society.
Yeah. Have any of you ever worked with anybody and seen the adaptations and the mechanisms that someone who cannot read will use? Do you have experience with that?
Yeah, I taught an adult literacy program, worked on an adult literacy program in Washington. And I saw people blow up in anger at DSHS, which is where we actually encountered a lot of our people that we ended up helping was hanging out at the DSHS office and watching people throw fits at social workers who were asking them to fill paperwork out and screaming at them, telling them that that was inappropriate for them to be asked to do that, but not being willing to admit how to do it. I'll take it home and do it at home when it's something that the social worker or office wants to be witnessed, and they don't want them to take it home because they think that's going to be fraudulent.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting because those are the same. So the best defense is a good offense, right? So if you don't want somebody to know something about you, get really mad at them and back them off, and get them away from you. So when I was working in the mediation program at Legal Services, I worked with a lot of parents, helping them develop parenting plans. And I would usually bring a laptop to the table. And the thing about mediation is it needs to reflect exactly what the parties have agreed to in terms of the language in the plan. So I would type it up at the table, and then we'd print it out, and I would hand each the mom and the dad a copy and say, why don't you guys look through this and tell me if I worded it right. And we would be at that point all warm and fuzzy and agreeing, and these were the ones where like, yeah, this is working, we're getting an agreement. And it took me probably longer than it should have to figure out that some of those fell apart right then and there, but it was because of reduced literacy or else being completely illiterate. And what I started to recognize a pattern. The men, if they couldn't read, would just push the plan back towards me and say, oh, it's okay, I trust you. I'll just sign it. I'd be like, no, this is a legal document. It's going to be filed with the court. The judges don't want to see you back in anything under a year. You really need to read it. I could have worded something wrong, Oh, it's okay, I'll just sign it. The women, having been all warm and fuzzy and agreeable and everything's going great, and this is a big deal, getting a parenting plan. This took sometimes days or multiple sessions of hours, would immediately say, can't believe you're asking me to do that. Kind of like how could you ask me to do that? I can't do that right now. I'm just going to take that home and I'll have someone else read it, and I can't even believe you did that. I don't even know if I'll call back. And off they'd go. It was all literacy. And so as soon as I figured that out, I stopped doing that. And I started, what I started doing was reading word for word through the entire plan so both parties could listen instead of asking them to do an assessment and tell me how they felt. The amount of reduced literacy in the United States is tremendous, and it is not easy to see. And so the families that you're working with who have complex, multi-paged, by the time you guys get them, some of them have files that fit in multiple boxes, treatment plans, court orders, summons to court, all kinds of things, really, truly may or may not be able to read them. And some of the decision-making or the emotional responses that seem like it just doesn't fit what was going on may really be that they can't read and they're not willing to say it out loud. So you need to pay attention to that. I want to see if I forgot. Okay. Increased mobility we already talked about. Means decreased stability. And then this last one is important to think about. If your grandparents lived a certain way, which all of ours did, and they raised your parents in a certain way, most likely your parents raised you with that same set of values and skills or something similar, then isn't that just how it is? So isn't that just how it is? Doesn't everybody just still love each other and have all the same family dynamics any other family does, and have babies and weddings and, you know, squabbles and fights over stuff? And isn't that just how it is? Yeah, so who says being in poverty is a bad thing and that they should make that different? Does that make any sense? Maybe it's just our problem. And I forgot to do my disclaimer at the beginning of this training that I almost always remember to do. I know that it is highly likely that all of us in this room have either been in poverty, love someone who's in poverty, or have significant relationships with people who live in poverty. So none of this is meant to be judgmental, except that everything about poverty is judgmental, so it's really hard to do that. But if that's just how it's been in your family for a long time, who says that's a bad thing? Think about that. It's just how it is. We know that in parenting, or at least there's one body of research that says your biggest source for how to parent your own children is going to be how you were parented. It's going to be your fallback. And what kids who have grown up in families with generational poverty learn is survival skills. How to navigate the community and get your basic needs met. That kids who grow up in families who've always had enough resources, even if it's modest resources, don't learn those same survival skills. So just think about that. One of the things that's not an impact of poverty, with poverty being the only factor, is a child's cognitive ability. So a baby who's born into poverty may come with all the same potential as any other infant anywhere. But what happens sometimes in those families is the disadvantages associated with poverty. It's families who the parents are working potentially 4 or 5 jobs between the two of them just to keep housing and food on the table, and may have unbelievably chaotic schedules, and it isn't a traditional have a bath and cuddle with mom and dad and read books, because there's no time or energy for that, because it's more important to keep the house and keep food on the table. It's the undiagnosed anxiety and depression, and the knowledge, if you live in generational poverty and things are really overwhelming, that this isn't going to get different next week. And it's not going to be different next month. And it's not going to be different next year. So there may be some self-medication with alcohol or other substances that reduce ability to parent. But kids who show up in a classroom with poverty being the only factor have got all the same possibilities as any other kids. I have another part of the disclaimer that I didn't do at the beginning, and that is that this training is designed to be provocative. So it, in a sense that it's supposed to make you think about things or it asks you to consider things you may or may not have ever had to consider. And when we first put it out there, this is a pretty toned down version actually, because the first few times that we ran it up in front of legal services staff and in a couple community groups in Helena, it was a few notches more provocative, and we actually had people have responses in training, like not being able to stay in the room. Or I did it for a community board one time and had one of the board members, he could stay in the room, but he got up and paced around and was like not okay with some of the challenges to his core values. So we moderate, but then what we realized is if it's too challenging, people can't hear it or consider it. So we made it a little milder. But one of the things that happened while I was reading the literature and looking at the websites was that there were themes that began to emerge. And it isn't even like I thought of this by myself either. One of the authors said, hey, there's themes in this in the United States. So, and there are, and I think there's three major ones, and they all have subsets. But one is that in the United States, some of us are brought up to believe that any individual from the humblest of origins can climb to well-being. So like this is the Abe Lincoln myth, right? Born in a log cabin with a dirt floor, splitting rails. His mom dies. His dad married somebody that he didn't like very much. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I don't think he liked his dad very much either. But he became president of the United States, right? And so think about how embedded that particular myth or core value is even in our elementary school materials. Think about things you might have said to your own kids. That would be, you know, you're gonna, everything will be fine if you just work hard enough, no matter what.
Isn't that true, actually? It should be worded, I think, to say the chances of an individual from humble origins climbing to well-being are the same as for anybody else.
That's a core American value. And I'll tell you a story in a minute, and then we can talk about whether we think it's true or not. Yeah, go ahead.
There's nothing wrong with thinking
No.
that everybody has the same potential.
There's not anything wrong with it.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, that's the thing.
But
It's
it's
that's the. I mean, if those were just things we were brought up with, then they're neither right nor wrong. They just are. So the next one is more of the Puritans. So it is the failure to achieve well-being through hard work indicates a flawed character. And actually there were, so this goes back to colonial, even pre-colonial United States, and 100 years into the United States, where if you were a person in the community who wasn't quite making it, every community had one or two or six, and everybody knew who they were, and everyone had an obligation to kind of help them, because the fact of the matter was, they just came that way. It was predestination, it was whatever it was. They came broken or damaged in some way, so we all had the obligation to help them, but they were never going to make it no matter what they did. And then the third one is more recent. Really comes out of the War on Poverty, the Great Society legislation, and the federal legislation in the 1960s and 70s. And you still hear this one very much alive and well, like on AM talk radio and some of the other types of political media, where society/government is responsible for poverty. And if we had never developed those programs that tried to help people get out of poverty, then we wouldn't have racism, bad schools, bad neighborhoods. The individuals are the victims of government or the victim of society. So those are three major themes, and there are probably other ones, and there's also subsets of all of these. But I think it's important to think about, especially if you're over 45, because some of the materials for school children are changing now, and a lot in our public education system, some of those embedded biases are being recognized, discussed, and removed from textbooks and things like that. But for me, they were all there. So think about which ones, if any, are part of your value system, and then think about, as you get a CASA caseload, how those values that you bring with you to work with that client and that case may impact your perception of how that case is going. That's kind of the important part of this training.
And that does trigger a lot of feelings with a lot of people. There was a couple of trainees in the last one.
Yeah,
They had real difficulty with
they did.
You noticed that too.
I did, and I hope the discussion we had last time actually helped with that. Because we all have core values. We get them mostly from our families, our communities, our faith communities as we grow up. Anytime you begin to feel agitated or frustrated or upset in a situation, what's happened is one of your core values has been challenged. And when core values or core beliefs are challenged for us as human beings, we start to get agitated and feel uncomfortable. We also start to lash out and be very judgmental because they're core, they're part of who we are. And so, is it really true in the United States today that any individual from any origin can climb out of poverty into well-being, and how we would define that would be, there's a million different ways, but let's just say that could actually achieve middle-class economic stability. Is that true? That any child born in the United States could have that happen for them?
Possibilities there, but the reality is not.
And there's the Cinderella stories, right? I mean, there's always one or two or 6 or 10 that people write books about, this amazing journey of this child who was born in abject circumstances who goes on to win a Pulitzer Prize, or someone with a really significant diagnosis, a mental illness or a disability, like the guy who owns UPS, who's autistic. And he's got a book out now. So yeah, those are very real people who've done amazing things. So I asked one of the attorneys years ago at Legal Services I said, just tell me a story about a client who lives in poverty. Just tell me a story. I'm going to go do this training and I'm getting tired of all my stories. And I need a new one. And so it was an instantaneous, yep, got one for you right now. So there was a young woman who lived in a community in Montana, about 20 years old, had an 18-month-old child, had a disability that prevented her from driving. And she had, within a few months, gone from being in a homeless shelter with her child to getting into public housing, getting a part-time job, and being in school part-time. So she and her daughter were on their way. She had a relative who lived in town who couldn't house her, but did try to do supports to drive her to appointments and things as necessary. But let's just say it was Missoula, and Missoula's got public transportation, and so she actually had access to buses, which in Montana, you have to recognize, you guys, as a state, we don't have transportation available to people if they don't have cars. Unless you live in one of the big communities, and even not all of them, Helena does not have a bus system. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the training, this is a very regulated population. And if you have public housing, or you get food stamps, or you get TANF funds, you are subject a couple times a year to having everything reviewed to make sure you are still eligible for that entitlement program. And you may have to have your home inspected to make sure that you haven't done any damage or it's not too dirty or all those kinds of things. And so she was coming up on her semi-annual re-qualifying, needing to demonstrate that she still had the need for the public housing. And she had an appointment with her housing person. And her relative was going to come and drive her to the appointment. In the morning of the appointment, her relative called and said, I'm really, really sorry. I got very, very sick last night. I cannot get in the car and come get you. And she said, it's okay. No big deal. I'll reschedule. So she called the agency right away, rescheduled the next appointment. Part of her disability was a visual disability, was one of the reasons she couldn't drive. I don't know that that was her only one. Wrote down the date and time of the next appointment and thought, okay. So, the next time the appointment came up in a couple of weeks, she got on the bus, went to the office, and she actually had written the time down wrong by 15 minutes when she wrote it down, or, at least that was the agency's perception. She was 10 minutes late for the appointment. The eligibility worker who was supposed to see her said, as per agency policy, if you're more than 10 minutes late, I do not have to see you. You will have to reschedule. That eligibility worker did not have another appointment at that time. But she was within her rights, within their policy, to turn this young woman away. So, she's scheduled for the third time. Now, I don't know if all of you know this, but most of the agencies have got a certain point where if you've no-showed or been non-compliant or there's a perceived non-compliance, then it's like a 3 strikes, you're out. So 3 strikes, you lose your health. So she's scheduled her third appointment. And she actually was very careful now because she knew this. She'd been doing it for a while. She was on her third chance. Got up early, got ready, had her child with her because as a working mom who was also a student, any time that she did not have to have her child in daycare and she could have her child with her, that was her preference. Got the little person, got her in her stroller, got to the bus stop only to see the bus had stopped and left. And I have heard in Missoula, and checked on this, that sometimes the mountain line actually gets ahead of schedule. So she ran back to her apartment, called the taxi, for which she had very little funding, tossed the kid in the taxi with her, got to the agency, and once again was more than 10 minutes late, and she lost her housing.
That's number 3 there.
Well, but here's the thing. So, young mom, couple of health problems, taking good care of her kid, got out of homelessness, got out of having to live with relatives, got her own apartment, had a job, was a couple years into job in school, was doing okay. They yanked her out. She and her daughter had to go back to the homeless shelter. This is a true story. Now, really? I mean, really, is she going to be middle class? Is she going to finish college? Is she going to get a graduate degree? Is she going to run for county commissioner or be on the city council or run for school board? Or really, can anybody?
Sure.
Well,
It says can, it doesn't say will.
Right.
shall, or
That's why I
might.
said,
Yeah.
it's not worded right.
Can't.
They be provocative.
Well, and that's
Of course she
actually a
can.
quote out of one of the
She
books.
could have
but-
gotten there on time too.
Because you only need one
Right.
example to prove that wrong.
Right,
And we all know.
right.
But
Be
the
a
point
15
is
minutes
that
early.
most of it at a significant disadvantage.
If your core value, and you have that mom on your caseload for her child, although she actually, legal services did intervene. She did get an attorney, which was no small feat because at that time there were 11 attorneys covering the whole state, and after I left, a couple years later, they had more cuts and it was much reduced. I think there were like 6. Her attorney actually was based in a different community in Montana and had to travel to this young woman's community here to represent her, and they did get a fair hearing. She did get her housing eligibility restated. At that point, though, when she lost her housing, she lost her job, and she lost her credits because she could not manage being homeless, having a toddler, and maintain a job and be in school. So she chose her kid, right? And here's another thing that I think is really interesting about that. At the end of the fair hearing, she said to her attorney, could you please ask them if I could have a different eligibility worker now? Yes. And the agency said no. She can't have a different. Now remember, this is an eligibility worker who had nobody in her office and could have seen this young woman the second time.
They'll never get fired.
They won't, right?
Yeah.
And declined. And So the agency said, no, it's not, it's in our policy not to reassign workers at the request of clients. And that was the point where my colleague, the legal services attorney, really went off shift. And that young woman did have a new eligibility worker before the attorney left the office.
It surprised me that she wasn't made whole also, you know.
How do you do that?
Court of equity, they can make whoever the government agency that's overseeing this that's caused this problem compensate her in some fashion that would put her back to where she
I've
was.
never seen that happen. I've had clients I worked with who got sanction letters yanking their benefits when they literally was just a bureaucratic mistake on the end of the
Like
agency.
Social Security or VA benefits, stuff like that, you get compensated
Yeah.
for those things that are lost. It may take you years,
Yeah.
but it goes back to when you first filed your complaint.
I've never seen it happen with food stamps, housing, or TANF, or daycare. Never. And the other thing is, well, or the time, because if you're really worried about how you're keeping food in front of your kid 3 times a day, you don't have time to do a legal battle. And I've had a client once who had her food stamps yanked, and it was the mistake of the agency, and it took just as long for her to not have food stamps as if she had been the one who hadn't made the appointment. And it was a complete and they didn't make her whole. She had to, I helped her, but we had to find a different way for her to get food. And it took, I think, the better part of 90 days for the agency to figure that out. So, I don't know that that it's really possible for any individual. There are the Cinderella stories, but the barriers are tremendous, and they are barriers that are not within people's control. So I think it's important for you to think about that, because you're going to meet these folks. These are going to be the moms and dads who struggle with their treatment plans, and you're going to be looking at them going, and why did you do that again? So there's another one, I can't quite remember where this story goes, but I had another client once who, I forgot to put this back on, who was a mom, and her son had to be removed and put in foster care. And she had a settlement coming. Part of her treatment plan said she would get housing and employment, and then we would be able to return her little guy to her. She had a settlement coming from a car accident. And actually, there was a way then, I don't know if it's possible now, that if you knew in advance that there was a big settlement coming, I think it was $5,000, that you could work with public assistance in advance so it wouldn't disrupt the regular benefits. We'd disclose everything and we would manage it. We would use it for first and last month rents. We'd get an apartment, get her furniture and all the things that she needed. And then we could get her little guy back to her. And as the time came closer for her settlement to arrive, she started getting kind of scarce. Like, I wasn't seeing her, I was having trouble finding her. She wasn't answering the phone, never good signs. And one day she showed up after having been non-responsive for about a week, and just showed up in my office unannounced and I said, "Did you get the settlement?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Where is it?" She said, "It's gone." It cost her her child. That little guy never went home. And I said, "Okay, tell me more about what happened, because we had this whole thing set up. It was going to work if you wanted it to." And what we hadn't known was that prior to the time that we removed her child, she was in a community of people who in poverty, and that reciprocity we talked about, people helping each other out. She had wanted to start a small business, and she had the skill set to do it. And some of the folks in her community had scraped together the money for her to actually start her small business, and she'd gotten some space and some equipment. And the deal was that she'd get that business off the ground, and then she would be able to pay them back, or potentially give them jobs there. I mean, this stuff actually happens. So when they knew that her settlement was coming, it was clear that her life had not gone well. Her son had been put in care. She wasn't doing very well. And they said, "Yeah, we're not going to get it back any other way, so we want it now." And so the other thing about being in a community of poverty is in a community where there's the reciprocity of relationships that keep families going and keep food in front of kids and roofs over heads, there is always going to be a greater need. So everybody knows everybody else's situations, because in order to maintain the relationships, you are in and out of each other's lives and households all the time, way all the time. And the community will decide, if they know that you have extra resources, that will get directed to a certain person in the community that may have given you food once but now needs shoes for their kids or gas for their car. So the value of saving money is really hard if you're in generational poverty, because if you have anything extra, reciprocity is going to demand that you share it, and not necessarily inappropriately. So if you see a family on payday out eating dinner before they go buy shoes for the kids, but you know they live in poverty, do you have a judgment about that? They go to Applebee's and instead of going straight to the store or saving the money to get what the kids need right away. You know, if you're never going to not be in poverty, at some point, don't you just go out and eat? I would. So anyway, it's those core values are important, because those are going to get challenged for you.
For the literature that's being changed on the school level, is any of that state-specific or just nationally?
It's actually, and this is probably for 20 years or more now, they've been examining all the textbooks trying to pull out those embedded stereotypes. It's national. Yeah.
Because I only question that because on a national scale, Montana has a whole different, each state, we don't have the inner city demographic that larger places or other East Coast states or California has.
Right.
So even with that national idealism being taken away from the literature, we still have this altruism and like an ideality that other states don't, because we don't have that. We don't see that. We don't understand that.
Right. We think we don't have it. We have 7 reservations. And what's happened on an educational level in Montana, I can't remember, maybe 2 legislative or 3 legislative sessions ago, we recognized that what was pervasive in our public education materials was a tremendous amount of racism about American Indians, Native Americans. And so there was an Indian Education for All Act passed by, I think, 2005 or 2007 that dedicated resources specifically to Montana public schools to start to look at what parts of the curriculum might have that embedded in it, not only how to get it out, but how to actually start appropriately, accurately, and positively teaching American Indian history. And I would say we don't have huge urban inner city poverty, but if you visit any of our 7 reservations, you will see poverty that rivals or exceeds inner city poverty with tremendous isolation. So difference, just different, right? Communication might be different, problem solving might be different, family relationships might be different, owning of property and priorities of ownership. So there's an author called Ruby Payne, and if you're in education, you may have heard of her. She is, she for a while there was the preeminent national public education speaker, and she's written some books. One of them is called A Framework for Understanding Poverty. She's got a couple like that. They're written all about public education settings, but her supposition is that poverty has a culture. Now be very careful where you say that, because it's very offensive to some people. And she's been absolutely shredded by some public education experts in the United States. And she does not go over well in Indian country. Because if you're American Indian and you have a culture that goes with language, history, skin color, location, geography, then being told that poverty is a culture is really pretty offensive. However, Ruby says poverty is a culture, and at one point she was commanding $20,000 a day to speak about it, and she's been in Montana a couple times. So what she would say is, like any other culture, it's just different. It's just different. If you went to France and something was different, it would just be different. We wouldn't have a judgment about it. And one of the things that she talked about is in poverty, property ownership is very different than in mainstream America. You may not own a car. The car may be your brother's friend's car that you borrowed and he went off to do something else somewhere else and never came back, and so you don't have clear title to your car. And you don't have the access or the money or the time to try to get clear title to your car. Those kinds of things. Family relationships may be different, and problem solving is very different in a culture of poverty. People who do live in poverty, one thing we know they don't need is our assumptions. So Ruby says poverty is generally equated to a lack of financial resources, but in reality, there are many other types of resources, and increasing any one resource, even a financial increase, even throwing money at poverty, will not eliminate it. If it had, the war on poverty would have worked and we wouldn't have poverty in the United States, right? So some of the other kinds of resources you need is that you need to be able to navigate your community, so you need to be pretty generally healthy. You need a good, solid support system that will consistently be there. You need a mentor who believes, in spite of anything else that may happen to you, that you absolutely can succeed with any goal that you set. You need something, it could be a spirituality or you can call it something else, but in order to move out of poverty, you need to believe that you are part of something larger than yourself. You need more money. And I think there's a couple more, but what she says is the increase has to happen in all 8 categories of resources. You can't, at the same time, for a period of time, in order for someone to move from poverty into low income, into middle class. And her books are eminently readable. This one was my favorite because I just found this one a little easier to understand than Ruby's. It's a little less academic. And this is David Shipler, whose book, The Working Poor, is also an amazingly good book and a very easy read. You need a set of skills, a good starting wage, a job with the likelihood of promotion are prerequisites. But so are the clarity of purpose, courageous self-esteem, a lack of substantial debt, freedom from illness or addiction, a functional family, a network of upstanding friends, and the right help from private or governmental agencies, and I would add, at the right time. And any gap in that array is an entry point for trouble, because being poor means being unprotected in the United States. And I have years and years of watching families get everything to line up, and you're right there with them, and then someone gets sick. And you're back to square one. And nobody had any control over it. Or one of the governmental agencies yanks a voucher, and they're back to square one. Say one of the adults breaks a leg, okay? Like not sniffles. I mean, we're just talking about trips on the ice, breaks a leg, and you're into 6 months of healing, casting, they lose the job. There you go. Medical bills, right? There you go. The other thing I really have seen happen, I worked with a program in our school district. Well, actually, I admired it from far, but it was a high school program, and most of the graduates in that program were the first of their family to finish high school. And I would go and help at their graduations, and it was this amazing thing because everybody was so proud of them. But there was also this acknowledgement that they'd done something no one else had ever done in their family. And the fact of the matter is, no one else in their family knew what that felt like. No one knew how to help them get there. So there is that sense when you're going to do something different than anyone else in your family or community has ever done, some folks will not want you to, right? But Shipler's book is really amazing. What we don't talk about in the United States much, and this is more Ruby stuff, is what are the strengths and the skills that it takes to live in poverty? One of the things Ruby does at the beginning of her framework of understanding poverty books is there's 3 quizzes. One is a set of questions that you could answer if you're mainstream middle class America. The next one is a set of questions you can answer if you live in poverty. And the third one is a set of questions to answer if you're very, very wealthy and you like have multiple homes. And so some of the questions, for example, would be if you cannot go buy new school clothes for your kids, what's the best way in your community to get decent, clean clothing for your kids before school starts? And a person who lived in poverty could name every secondhand store, which ones had the best, cleanest clothes, which days to go because they put new stuff out, which racks to look on first because that's where the good stuff was, and which days they might have a 50% off sale so you could get twice as many, right? A middle class question might have been, how are you going to do planning to pay your property taxes every year? How do you budget for property taxes, car insurance, things like that? And then the other, and I have to tell you, I took the quizzes and I did the one for the very, very wealthy people, and there was stuff on there like, so if you're going to change from your main residence to your vacation residence in France, what do you have to do to call ahead to get the residence opened up for you? And, things like that. I was like, I don't know, I'd love to figure that out. But the point of those 3 quizzes was, if any one of us were tossed into poverty tomorrow, unless we've already been there and learned it, there would be things that we would literally not know how to do. And no one ever talks about that. People who live in generational poverty have got a skill set for survival that the rest of us may not have. Flexibility, tolerance, and spontaneity. If you live without adequate resources every day, you're going to have a high tolerance level for things that other people might not tolerate. One way I describe this is a 2-bedroom public housing unit in Helena is probably about 800 square feet. The kitchen, living, dining area are all one. So there's the kitchen, a little linoleum, and then carpeted area for living. There's a short hall, a very small bathroom, and then 2 small bedrooms. That might be a house with a mom, a dad, and 2 kids in it, if the kids are the same gender. And in that 700 or 800 square feet, there is nowhere that you can put something down and know that it's going to stay there. So if a child values a particular toy, or if a parent has important papers, there's very little room for everything a family of 4 needs. So how are you going to keep track of your stuff? And then remember reciprocity. And remember, any given day, you're going to have all kinds of community members in your house, through your house. You're going to be watching other kids. You're going to be feeding other people's kids. You're going to have people coming over because they need rides, or you need to line up a ride for them, or so-and-so needs this or that. So you have to be able to tolerate a high amount of traffic in your life every day, very small living space, and a great inability to protect anything that has great value to you in a way that means it will be there and it will be safe. You have to have spontaneity because you may wake up and you've just gotten a new job and you go out, and this is an actual scenario. New job, car wouldn't start, car that didn't have clear title but had been working okay because it belonged to the uncle's brother so-and-so who was off doing something else. The neighbor who's been watching your kids informally, who looked like she was always going to be home with her kids, forgot to tell you the day before that she's decided she's not going to do that anymore, so she won't watch your kids today or any other day. And you're already at the door with 20 minutes to get to work. You get the erroneous sanction letter that yanks your food stamps. And you realize the food that you bought for a week is only going to last 3 days, and your Section 8 voucher is about to expire. It's the first week of a new job, your kid is sick, and so on, and so on, and so on. Spontaneity. Problem solving in the moment, not long-term problem solving, but how am I going to resolve what I need to resolve in the next 20 minutes so that I can get to work, so I don't lose my new job, is something that I have to say I have unbelievable admiration for the clients I've worked with who were able to still get to work somehow that day and maintain that job with multiple barriers happening to them with no notice. And so we don't talk much about that. There really are problems every day when you don't have adequate resources. If I walk out in the morning and one of my cars won't start, I got so many options. I can call AAA, I can call my husband, I can call my other family that lives in town, I can commandeer one of the cars that actually belongs to me that my young adults think belongs to them because they drive it all the time. I could call a taxi. You know, I can write a check, I can use a credit card, I can get to work on time. I can call my boss and say, hey, my car won't start, it's going to take me a couple hours to figure it out, and my job is not in jeopardy because of that. But any given day that I had all that at 8 in the morning, I'd be a wreck. And that really does happen.
Is there anyone, and I realize that it comes down to resources and funding, but is anyone in the various counties or state looking at trying to assist in the public transportation issue that like aids?
To get a voucher or something for like a cab service?
Yeah.
Because even several of us who are of the middle class or not below the poverty line would love to ride the bus, but you know, it's done by 6:30 at night.
I know.
Or you maybe need to get to work before 6:30 in the morning and you can't.
There is Medicare. So for medical appointments and mental health appointments, Medicaid and Medicare will fund taxis. So lots of kids and families on your caseloads are going to have Medicaid travel. Every community in Montana is different. In Helena, they've been trying for more than a decade to figure out how to fund a bus system like even one like you have here in Missoula, and it just, the ridership won't pay for it. So it has to be subsidized by city government, and they just haven't been able to get there. They've had short stints of, so yeah, lots of people are trying, but it's just a really difficult geography and environment to be able to do that. So another story about problem solving, another true story. So I had a client one day who didn't show up for mediation, and it was the 4th or 5th time we were going to meet. We were almost done, and I was kind of surprised, but because I was no longer in CPS, I no longer had to document that they didn't show, and it no longer jeopardized a child's life. So I was like, yeah, no shows were no big deal. I was like, yeah, okay, good, we'll reschedule. And she called me the next day, and she was very apologetic, and she said, I am so sorry that I didn't get to call you yesterday. And I said, it's okay, we'll just reschedule. She said, well, it's important to me to tell you what happened. I picked my daughter up from school, and she had a lot of pain in her jaw, and I looked at it and realized her jaw was swollen. She had a tooth that really hurt. And so I needed to get her into a dentist. Now, I don't know about Missoula, but in Helena, Medicaid dentists at that time were few and far between. And just because your kid had a toothache, if you were on Medicaid, did not mean you were going to get into a dentist anytime soon. And so somehow, because she was persistent and had a lot of skill, she managed to get a dentist who would see her child the next morning before mediation. And she got up the next morning, and her pickup truck would not start. And her focus was getting her kid to the dentist. So she said, so I knew my starter was going, Dana, and my dad had bought me a new solenoid. And he had it in his garage, and he was going to put it in the weekend, but he was gone out of town that day. But I knew the part was at his house. He lived about a mile from her. So she walked to his house, got the solenoid, went back to her house, put it in her truck, and got her kid to the dentist appointment on time. But forgot to call me and say, I'm not going to make it to my appointment. Right? Now, I can do some stuff to a car, and more when they had carburetors than now that they have computer chips. But unbelievable skill set. I mean, she was dead set that her kid was going to get to that. And they lived not in town. They lived significantly, like miles and miles out of town. And so there's a strong skill set there, and I don't think we talk enough about that. It's really important, though, to think about a couple of things, and I've tried to model it today. We talk about the poor people. I've tried to actually say people who live in poverty. Because when we label folks, any kind of people, if people label us, then what happens is our individuality starts to disappear. So it's important how we talk about our clients and the people that we work with and serve is very important. And so the first thing I'd like all of you to think about is listen to yourself when you talk about this work and how you are not describing folks. should spend some time thinking about what your own assumptions or biases might be. We all have them. There is not a human being that does not bring themselves to their work and all of their relationships, and we all have core values and biases. But if you know what yours are and how they may impact how you view your clients or the kids on your caseload, two things will happen. You will get a greater understanding of the people that you're going to work with, and you will be less frustrated. If you have an appointment where an adult no-shows, or if the social workers are saying to you, yeah, I'd like to think about putting Johnny back home, but mom's missed the last 3 visits, then just take a minute and try to get somebody to find out, well, why really? Like, why did she really miss the last 3? Was she really blowing it off, like sometimes parents do, hitting crunch time, not going to make the treatment plan, or really did something else happen where that particular day something else had to rise to the top? Try to find out. So you'll be frustrated less often. Now, the other thing that's important is being in poverty does not excuse bad behavior towards other people. So if you have a client who uses inappropriate language, raises their voice, I mean, those are bad behaviors. It's, you know, that anybody could have bad behavior. But if you have a client who's not meeting a middle class value about being at an appointment on time with all their stuff with them or calling, then that's not necessarily bad behavior if that person was juggling survival that day. And you will be less frustrated and you'll have better client relationships. So one of the things that Ruby Payne studied was how people communicate. And this is also somewhat controversial, although I have to say I have anecdotally found it to be accurate. She put some sociolinguistic information in her book. Sociolinguistics is a context for language, and I don't know if any of you have ever studied linguistics in here, but I just have to tell you it's an extraordinarily complex field, and it's very mathematical, and it's tied in with all kinds of really complex stuff. So linguists are very smart people. Within English, or probably other languages too, there are registers of language. And so that's levels and types of language. And standard English is a register of language in English, and it is called, it's a formal register. It's used for newspaper, radio, job interviews, politicians. It's what you hear on TV, by and large, radio ads, those kinds of things. It's our day-to-day language. The casual register is language used with friends in informal situations. It may also be the language used with people who live in generational poverty. It's got about an 800-word vocabulary, which is very, very small. It's the language of storytelling, and it is a language that it's not linear, it is not beginning, middle, end. It's circular, because the point isn't to be linear. The point is to be engaging with friends and have relationship and be entertaining and tell good stories. The casual register is very dependent on nonverbals, facial expressions, body language, and you can't actually understand what is going on if you don't integrate all of the body language with the casual register. The thing about it is that standard English is 2 registers higher than the casual register, and what Ruby says is that any time you're more than 1 register higher or lower on the chart than another type of language, then you are miscommunicating. Then you will not understand each other. And so if what she says is true, that the casual register is the language of generational poverty, that means if you come out of a standard English register, right away you're already at a disadvantage. Right away you're miscommunicating. Right? Now, I'm not saying that she's 100% accurate, but I have had a lot of experience with this. I had a mediation one day. It was a mom and a dad, and the mom had taken the little people out of state without telling dad, even though they were no longer together. And she'd been gone for a couple months. And she hadn't called, emailed, nothing. He didn't know where she was with the kids. But we did get them to agree to come into mediation to get a parenting plan. And Dad sat down at the table and said, okay, I'm here, but I'm not participating or doing anything until she tells me exactly where she was and why she was gone so long and how come she never called me and told me where she was with the kids. I thought, yeah, well, that makes sense. I don't blame him. I said, okay. So I turned to the mom and said, well, so Sarah, where did you go with the kids and why were you gone so long and how come you didn't call? Because Dad was worried. Even though you guys might be kind of mad at each other, he was worried about the kids, and that makes sense. And so she said, well, so my sister in Idaho was going to have a baby, and I had promised her, this wasn't her first baby. I think this was like her third baby, and I had promised her that she had those other little two at home, so I was going to come and stay with her while she went to the hospital and had the baby, and then I would stay and help out for a while after she had the baby, just for a few days to kind of help her get back on her feet. And so time was coming close, and her due date was coming up, so I thought, well, I guess me and the kids, we better go to Idaho. So I loaded them up in the car, and we drove over there, and it's a good thing because we got there just in time. She went into labor, and her husband, he tries to help, but he's got that full-time job, and he's really tired when he gets home, and he's really hungry when he gets home, and so he needed some help. So she went into labor, and she went to the hospital. Now, it hadn't happened with the other two that she had to have C-sections because everything went fine, but something happened with this one, like the cord got wrapped around this baby's neck, and they had to do a C-section, and then she had to stay in the hospital for a few days. So I had to stay at her house to take care of the other two and, get dinner ready for her husband and stuff. And then my little guy, she had 3 kids with her, my little guy, turns out he was allergic to their dog. And he started breaking out in hives, like all over, and he was all really itchy, and it was just horrible. But it was okay, because I figured out that he could go across town to stay with my Aunt Sally, because she didn't have a dog. So I took him over there. And that made things a little bit harder because then he was kind of missing his sisters. And so I had to spend some time every day trying to get across town so that we could see him so he didn't feel so lonely. But that was okay because Aunt Sally was taking good care of him. And then, she came home from the hospital with the baby and everything was good. But, then they told her she couldn't lift anything and she couldn't vacuum. And so I thought, well, I better stay longer. So that was okay, though, because it was going okay. And I guess we'd been there about 2 weeks when I thought, well, it's okay. I loaded up the car and told them we were going to leave the next day. And so I loaded up the car, put the kids to bed, got them up the next morning, and then we had to go over to Aunt Sally's. I was thinking that'll be our first stop, and we'll pick up the little guy because he never could come back because of that dog allergy. Every single time he came in the house, the hives started again. It was just horrible. Well, I went out, and the car wouldn't start. She said, but it was okay. Because Aunt Sally's son, Rob, knows how to fix cars. So he came over and he looked at it and he told me what was wrong with it. And he said if I could buy the part, he'd put the part in for me. But I was out of money. So that was all right because now, the baby was home and Mom was home. She was feeling better. I could get a job just to get the money for the part. And so she'd watch my kids so I could get a job. So I got the money for the part. Well, that took a while. Because, you have to get the job, you have to wait for your first paycheck, you got to get the paycheck, you got to get the part. You can't let them know that you only want the job for a little while to get money for the part. So anyway, eventually she got home with the kids. This took a long time, and it was all face and hands and, yeah. Well, I can still see it because I was sitting there thinking, oh, wow. Oh, my gosh. And she never did say why she hadn't called. Yeah, and they had a tremendously conflictual relationship. She had no interest or any sense of obligation to let him know where the kids were. But there were several things about that. That was all casual register. It was very circular. And what I used to tell the attorneys I worked with, it was part of the training, you are going to have to go in and make this linear. Attorneys, no offense to any of you who are attorneys, but I lived with my husband while he went through law school, and it's an indoctrination, and you learn to think like this, and you need the facts, and you need to organize your information this particular way. And, people who live in poverty and have are talking in casual register are not going to lay stuff out in a nice, neat, organized way for you. But it doesn't mean the information isn't in there, and it's your responsibility to go get it. Now, the other thing that's really important about that is relationship is the #1 priority. So, a lot of decisions about how a client feels about you or is willing to work genuinely with you or not are going to be made on whether or not they want to be in a relationship with you. It's really important when you have an initial relationship with someone, express appreciation for that first story they tell you. Don't interrupt the first time, no matter how badly you just need the facts. Because the attorneys used to just say, yeah, but Dana, this has nothing to do with the facts that I need to get. And I was like, yeah, but be respectful, listen to the story, express appreciation. So with this young woman, I said, wow, so did your little guy really recover from the itchy hives thing? Did that all go okay? To let her know I had listened to the whole story, and I was hoping it wasn't going to send off a whole nother thing, but it didn't. Watch the body language, because they're watching you. Integrate what you see with expressions, pay attention to that, and then it's your job to ask the clarifying questions. You're the professional person associated with meeting whatever demand you've been plugged into that case or that life for. It is your job to know how to get the information you need. It is not the client's job to lay it all very, very nicely out for you. I reference attorneys a lot, but attorneys would get very frustrated when clients would show up and not be very focused on, here's what we're going to do today, here's the documents you needed. I think sometimes it was the client's job was actually to manage to get there that day. It was a huge accomplishment. So we talked about living space. More people in small space, more conflict. More active efforts to protect your stuff, your belongings, and your relationships. Values and norms in a community of poverty, and this is Ruby again, mean any unexpected additional financial resources need to be shared with someone in greater need, unless the community's decided that you're it. And any unexpected additional resources need to be spent quickly if they belong to you, because otherwise the community knows and has identified the need. It's all reciprocity and it's all relationships. So middle class America doesn't work this way. It really doesn't. I mean, I guess if my neighbor comes over and says, can I have a couple eggs or some sugar because I'm making cookies and I don't want to run to the store, but my neighbors don't come over and say, I can't feed my kids tonight, what do you got? And need me to cough it up. And I would, but think about how hard it is to have a savings account if this is the environment you're in. Everybody knows what everybody makes. By and large, everybody's got the same types of jobs that are paying the same types of wages, and you know how much people are working. And so it's pretty easy to spot if someone's popped up with additional funding. The other thing, too, problem solving. Take some time to think about how in your own lives you were taught, or maybe not taught, or someone modeled for you how to solve a problem. There's a ton of research on problem solving and how our brains work at it. It's actually a fairly complex cognitive function. I learned when I did not know that till I did this research. But the one problem-solving method that I think most people are familiar with because we start learning it in grade school is the scientific method. Recognize and formulate the problem, collect data through observation and experimenting, formulate and test solutions. That applies to pretty much any kind of problem solving. There are a lot of steps to problem solving, and they are linear. So if you have lived a life where there's been chaos, a lot of variables that were unpredictable or perhaps not in your control, a lot of spontaneity, flexibility, and tolerance because of the demands of your environment, then a 1, 2, 3 process of problem solving may not be something you have any experience with. It may never have been modeled for you or taught to you. First of all, any one of us has to recognize that there's a problem in our environment, okay? The second thing we do, probably without thinking much about it, is decide how significant it is. How uncomfortable is that problem making me? How many people does it impact? How often? How important is it to change it? And then what are the long and short-term implications of doing that? In human behavior, most of us have to become fairly uncomfortable with a problem before we will decide to take the steps to change it. Yeah, I would like to lose 10 pounds, but so far, I haven't modified my behavior because I'm not miserable enough yet. Pretty soon I will be, but really, just because there's a problem that's been identified doesn't mean people are going to act on it. Don't assume that you and your client have the same perspective about the problem. And that could be a tough one sometimes, because when an attorney is retained for a service, their assumption is that the client is focused on that service as they are all the time. But in this world, not so much. Don't assume that the client believes there is a problem or has identified it in the same way you are, or that you're talking about the same thing. So check in a lot. Ask a lot of clarifying questions. Ask your clients or the social workers or all the service providers in your cases, when you say treatment plan, what exactly do you mean by that? When you say family group decision-making meeting, what exactly does that mean? Make sure you're in the same conversations. The other thing is, don't assume that before you have a meeting with a client that problem has been tended to in detail. At Legal Services, folks would have called the hotline, been accepted for services, gotten an appointment with a paralegal or someone, maybe an attorney if they were really lucky. Just the steps to do that were huge. So they come to the appointment, and it might be the first time in weeks or days that they've had time to think it through. And they may or may not bring everything they need with them, because just getting that far was already a ton of detail. And just because someone meets with you about something one day, recognize 10 things could happen in the next week in their life that are going to pull them away from being able to focus on that specific problem, all of which may be survival related. Housing, food, jobs, transportation. So you may be thinking about the problem and looking forward to your next meeting to talk about it, and you may get into that meeting and find out that they are looking at you going, okay, where did we leave off again? Because they have literally not had a minute to tend to it in the interim. This gets hard when parents are on treatment plans, because you start to watch the time clock and you've learned all the time frames and the things not getting checked off and are wondering, you might have to help people stay focused on that. The final step of problem solving is actually one of the most complex for all of us. You need to make a plan, or strategy, or an action that will address the problem. And that requires being able to project yourself into the future, because you haven't solved the problem yet, but you're imagining a time when it's solved and you've developed a strategy to get there. Now, we haven't talked about brain development, but some of you will be working with with children who have very young parents. And the latest, greatest brain research is that the female brain matures and is all developed at 22. Anyone want to guess about guys? 25. So yeah, 25. And the last part of your brain to develop, and we know this now because of all the imaging and things that didn't used to be available, is the prefrontal cortex right here. It is the part of the brain that governs impulse control, problem solving, and the ability to project yourself into the future. So if you have young adults who are males, I have 3 of them, and you're watching them try to plan for the future, there may be varying kinds of that going on. And it looks kind of awkward and funny, or it looks great if any of them watch this on TV in Missoula. 2 of them live here. But the fact of the matter is if you can't project yourself into the future because that part of your brain isn't done, it just doesn't matter who says what to you. You can't change brain development. If you work with young parents, this is going to need some attention. I worked with a very young set of parents in mediation. They were in their late teens. They had a baby. They were both very determined to take very good care of that baby and doing a great job, but they needed a parenting plan. And neither one of them had a car, and neither one of them was going to have a car, and as I mentioned, no public transportation. So we were talking about how to transport the baby back and forth from household to household for visits. And they had a very nice stroller for the baby, and they lived about a mile apart. And they agreed that they would meet like in the CVS parking lot. Appointed days and times, mom would wheel baby to dad and vice versa. And we were doing this mediation in the spring. And so I said, yeah, okay, that's good. First baby, young parents. I said, let's talk about fall and winter, because judges do not like to see parenting plans back in front of them in under a year, and they really hate it when it's only been 3 months. It does not go well. And these were highly motivated young people. These were not folks trying to be difficult or oppositional. We met 4 more times before they could project themselves into understanding that when the snow hit, maybe the stroller wasn't going to work so well. And what if it was really pouring rain, or what if it was below zero and really windy? And they were not trying to be difficult. We had to walk baby step by baby step by baby step into the next season to try to help develop things we could put in their plan that would be a backup for them when the weather changed. That was all brain development. They did not have the capacity. They didn't have another child. They didn't have any experience with this. So you're asking folks to look way into the future when they're working to get their kids back. Check and see, they may not be being difficult. They may need help. Problem solving requires retrieving data from your memory, using data to predict whether the problem is going to continue, understanding cause and effect or the consequences of a problem, projecting yourself into the future and picturing the result of a planned change, weighing pros and cons internally to think about it before you simply react. So think how much a treatment plan, have you guys looked at treatment plans? Yeah, when you see your first treatment plan that is the mechanism by which those kids are going to go home, think about it as you read each section of the treatment plan, how much problem solving and projecting into the future is in that document. And it may be you who says to the social worker, this is too much. We're not going to make it. But it's important to think about it. And these are the things, if you don't take anything else away, that I want you to really think about. People who live in poverty every day don't have control over daily life. Life in poverty really, truly is unpredictable, and help is not a phone call away. Shipler said, being in poverty means being unprotected. There's not a safety net. So be careful before you judge why a parent made a decision. Check into it a little further. Don't assume that the client has the time to think the problem through and plan for the future. If you think about how you do problem solving in your own life, it's a really significant issue. Some of us might sit down with a pad and paper and make a list. Some of us might sit down and just think, like wait till the kids are in bed and go, okay, now I got to really think about this and I got to plan what I'm going to do. Where does time like that come in a day if you're a single parent living in 700 square feet with 2 jobs, no transportation, substandard daycare, and you're worried about where food's coming from the next day? Or the school has called and Johnny got a slip and has detention, or sitting down and thinking that problem through. Where's that time come from? It might not come until they're sitting in someone else's office, and that protected time happens right then and there. Not that we don't all have the ability to do this complex process, But we do have to be respectful and realize that it doesn't just happen like this. It requires time and energy. And then at the back of your PowerPoint, there's a bibliography of the sources that I used for this. And so that's the end of my presentation. But before I go, I will see if you have any questions. But the other thing is, I want to thank all of you very much in advance for taking the time to be CASAs. And I know you don't have young people on your caseloads yet, but you will. Your job is really important. Court-appointed special advocates are just that. You're the advocate for that child. There are fine professionals all across the state who work with children and families and desperately want to keep those kids in families or get those kids back in their families as fast as they can. That's always the initial goal. Caseloads are huge. Time is short. The demand is really high. You will have the luxury, if you want to call it that, of being the person assigned to this child where that focus on is what's happening in the best interest of the child really happening or not. You may be the only person sometimes who can call something to the attention of the other professionals that really does need to be addressed. And you may find that that sometimes is received fine or even with gratitude of, oh, I never thought that, you're right, we've got to figure that out. You may find that sometimes you create frustration or even that other professionals working with that child get mad at you. And I only say that because I've seen it happen. We had a family group decision-making conference years ago in Helena, and there was a CASA at the table. And have you talked about family group decision-making meetings? It's a mechanism Child and Family Services use. It's a really good mechanism where they try to pull every single stakeholder in that child's life into the room at one time and get a very child-focused plan for that child. And so we had done that with this child, and I used to facilitate those and was supposed to be neutral, which is can be kind of hard sometimes. And this CASA, this was a little kindergartner guy, and the only way that his school could be maintained was that he had to ride a bus across town that was the dial-a-ride for $1 bus, which they do have, or did in Helena at that time. And he was doing that. So he had been returned to mom, and the only way to maintain his school was for her to pay the $1 every day for him to go to school on the dial-a-ride bus and come back that afternoon. Now, no one could know who would be on the bus with him, and no one necessarily could know even who would be driving the bus in terms of safety for that child, or that he wouldn't just decide to get off somewhere in between, being 5. And the CASA was the only person at the table in that meeting who kept saying all the big issues, we planned it, we had needs, concerns, we matched it all up, we had a great plan going, and so this woman just kept saying, okay, I'm really not all right that he's riding this bus across town. And we were all like, yeah, okay, but that's just how it is. And even me, who was supposed to be neutral, was like, well, yeah, but this is really complicated, and there's no resource, and this is okay. There was nothing okay about it. But it was an overburdened system, and the big issues had been addressed in the plan we had written that day, and she just persisted and said, no, okay, yeah, good plan, except for tomorrow morning he's getting back on the dial-a-ride bus to go to school, and that really is not okay. And finally, I think like the 3rd or 4th time, everybody looked at her and went, oh, yeah, you're right, that's really not okay. But there were no resources. I mean, so everyone in that room knew that in order to change that one thing about that little guy's day, someone was going to have to either cough up money or time. And everybody already felt pretty stretched. And there wasn't anyone in the family that was there that was going to be able to do it. And so, but she was right. And so the social worker assigned to that case said, she's right. And until they could work with the school district to get appropriate transportation for him, the social worker went and picked that little guy up and took him to school and brought him home every day. Because otherwise, if mom had to try to do it. One, she didn't have a car, and two, it was going to jeopardize her job. And it was that little piece in the case. Everyone was feeling really good about it, but that little guy's experience was changed by that CASA hanging in there at that table saying, okay, yeah, but yeah, but how about this? And I don't know that everybody was particularly nice to her that day. So don't worry if people look frustrated or anxious. If you have a real concern about a child, hang in there, call Dennis, check with the mentor to make sure you're on the right track. But thank you mostly so much for doing this work, because it really does make a difference for kids.